Welcome to Neurotypical's Don't Juggle Chainsaws, the podcast that cuts through the rubbish to explore the world of neurodiversity. I'm your host, Nick King.
And I'm your host, Kate Fox. And together we're here to explore, understand, and celebrate being neurodivergent in a neurotypical world. From ADHD and autism to dyslexia and other quirky brains, we talk about it all.
And go off on tangents. So whether you're neurodivergent, love someone who is, or you're just curious about neurodivergent minds, you are in the right place.
Let's get ready to juggle some words and maybe even a few chainsaws, metaphorically, of course.
Hello again. It is me, Nick King, our fabulous co-host, Kate Fox, and Kieran. I believe we said it was a trilogy. It's going to be a Douglas Adams trilogy, maybe possibly in many, many parts, but this is definitely number 4. We finished the podcast of the trilogy that was definitely a trilogy, and we were doing some reflection on how important reflection is and how that is actually fundamental within understanding our narrative, understanding our history, and thinking about how we move forward as a community.
So therefore, that sounded like a very pregnant pause. I'm filling the pause. So therefore, this is going to be a reflective episode about reflection. And I think there's also something about reflecting on what use there is to doing that as an individual as well, who operates within probably multiple communities, be they, a nearby family, be it a place community, a school community, a work community, a community that is not just made up of fellow neurodivergent people.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful as it is when that is the case. Apparently some other types of people exist in the world. Do we have to interact with them? So there we are. Do we have a responsibility therefore? Kieran, what's your reflections on what our reflections about reflection are going to involve?
I think you've used a very, very important word there, which is responsibility. And there are so many systems around us and people around us, and often ourselves as well, who don't reflect on our responsibility to others and ourselves as well. So keeping it within the context of what we've talked about in the kind of the previous three, the history. So everything at the heart of everything that I teach is reflective practice, is about actually looking at ourselves, thinking about our privileges, thinking about why we think the way that we do, and then the impact of thinking the way that we do. So as autistic people, when we go on that kind of that X Factor journey of self-discovery, and we start to figure out who we are, then sometimes we can latch onto things which might be problematic or we don't understand well enough. And then sometimes we can build an identity around that thing. Sometimes we can communicate things which we don't fully understand or think we understand and don't know well enough. So one of the questions that I always ask when I'm teaching is, what don't you know? And how do you know what you don't know as well? How do you even know to ask yourself that question? Because that's a question that all of us should be asking ourselves in terms of, thinking about future-proofing what we do as much as best we can and mitigating the harm that we do. It's that question of what don't we know? And therefore, are we acting in a way which might be causing harm or communicating harm for ourselves, for our community, for the messaging that we want to go out without even realizing it? And that's the key to this, is looking in the mirror and challenging ourselves on so many different levels.
And it's incredibly uncomfortable to do that. It's incredibly uncomfortable to hold that mirror up to yourself and thoroughly examine your own behavior and your past, or your plans for the future, or where it might have gone wrong, or even where it might have gone right. And that it's an emotionally difficult thing to do. And I find, and I we find, when we're training people, that often if you have a negative reaction from somebody from the information you're giving them, It's that they're nowhere near ready to do that reflection, and they're not doing that reflection. And there's almost sort of like, why would this matter to me kind of thing. Do you know what I mean? It's just not, they're not there, but they are interacting with autistic people and with our community, and then not knowing what they don't know, and not possibly considering what they could be doing that could be harmful.
I think there's a balance to be found between those of us that might be described as advocates or call ourselves advocates or whatever. That level of responsibility then goes up a lot higher, I truly believe. That need to be reflective, that need to understand the narratives around us beyond our own experiences, becomes really important. There is absolutely 100% value for me in people, telling their life stories and talking about themselves, but in order to kind of get a broader message out and not making it about ourselves, and to help other people not center autism in us as an individual, then we need to help them get out of just our experience as well. We need them to understand that there is a much broader context happening here, and lots of different experiences, experiencing things in lots of different ways. And there is a huge responsibility around that. And I see so many people who we might describe as like baby auties, who have recently come across being autistic or figured that out, or being. And when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about people who might have been diagnosed like 4 or 5 years ago. That's still very fresh and very new. I've been trying to figure myself out for the past 20 years and figure out these narratives for the past 20 odd years, and I'm still nowhere near close. So there is a responsibility to do what I describe as doing the work, which is to actually soak ourselves as much in figuring out where have these narratives come from, how do they directly influence us, how might they be influencing other people and having an impact on other people, and then how we communicate that through all of that. And that's, at my beginnings, that's not something that I did. It's something that I've had to learn to do over the course of it. And it does worry me when you go on TikTok and you see what I call like 30-second or 60-second advocacy, people who haven't done the work, but have heard someone else talking about something and then just regurgitate what they do without being critical about it or pushing back into it. And that's that being uncomfortable. That's that looking in the mirror, is actually thinking about, well, I've been presented with this information. What does this mean? Where does it come from? Where does it go? And how do we think about that? That's what reflective practice is, and it should be at the key of everything that we do as communicators.
I absolutely agree, although I'm going to say that for so many of us and so many people generally, it's really hard to find spaces to do reflective practice. That's even if you recognize that it's something you should be doing, which actually, we'll call that a moot point for lots of people. That comes under the category of things we do not know, if you know what I mean. So just to kind of make this a bit concrete, what for each of you, and I'll think about it in answer to, how have you, where are your places or spaces, or what do you do? What are your practices of reflective practice?
Should I go first, Kieran?
Mm-hmm.
I think I do take space, and I do take space to consider everything I do. I take space to consider where I'm getting my information and the context of that information, and how, because particularly I do sort of, because you do then regurgitate information, particularly because I've got a course for young people. I have to really contextualize what I'm telling them and how I'm telling them that, and really, really consider that to make sure it is not harmful, particularly because they are under 18, and that's very important. I talk to people a lot. I will tell anyone in the world if they send me an email, and if I think they're a passionate person, I will sit with them on Zoom no matter where they are in the world for an hour, because I'm just genuinely interested in talking to people who are passionate about autistic people and autism. And I think, gaining those other insights into our community and other people's experiences, and widening your knowledge of narratives and how other people are experiencing their privilege, other people are experiencing discrimination, other people are just experiencing, their life right now. And that's different across the UK, it's different across the world, and I find it so incredibly interesting. And just sort of surrounding yourself as much as you can within your community, and then stepping back and thinking about it, and stepping back and holding it for a moment. I'm not good at holding things for very long because I don't have the attention span for it. But like, you know, taking the time to reflect. Me and Kieran did this amazing thing the other day, where we talked about Bruno Bethheim with somebody there, and I haven't stopped thinking about that for 48 hours, and I am still not quite ready to record the video that I will then go and put into our community forum. But I'm almost there, because you just need that space and that time, and to an extent that's a privilege, but I think you need to carve that out if you are in a position where people are listening to you, and quite literally in this situation.
There's huge wisdom to that, huge wisdom, and obviously huge benefit. I'm going to think of, and we have named her, we've talked about her, so I'll just come back to her. Christine McGuinness, I bet she's there in a mansion with Paddy, and she's chatting to the Daily Mail, and she's doing her nails, whatever she's doing. Sorry, Christine. She does not, I'm betting, she's not going, oh, I need to find my community where I can have some reflective practice. She doesn't know this community. She hasn't known, she might do now. She doesn't know what reflective practice is. She just doesn't. And she actually might not, so we'll make her a bit more hypothetical, she might not really enjoy talking to people or feel confident to do that. What hope is there? What the heck's she going to do? Do you know what I mean? Like, this is why, in a sense, it is important that there are spaces, but I can see there are many barriers for someone like her to having that. Where's she going to get it?
Yeah, I think we have to remind ourselves that, again, we're at the beginnings of something. So we are scrabbling around. We are a group of traumatized people who are supporting a group of traumatized people. That's bi-directional. And we are making things up from scratch because the infrastructure for us does not exist. We have had to create our own and are creating our own. And there will be huge gaps. There will be people who fall through those gaps. There will be, you know, spaces that we can create which aren't going to be accessible to everybody. So we're at the beginnings of something, and that's again part of being reflective, is being conscious of that, and then thinking about, well, hold on a minute, if I've created a space which is safe for myself, but there are people who are not in this space, how do I make it safe for other people? Or, you know, my space might never be safe for some groups of people, so how do I support them to make their own spaces? And, you know, so that's where you level up and you get to that next kind of step of thinking about this kind of stuff. And it's one of the biggest things for me was ironically learning to shut up. That I had when I eventually figured out to connect to a community that I didn't know existed, and finding my space in that and finding my role in that. I had lots of things to say, and then I found that other people had lots of far more important things to say that I should really, you know, so a lot of this was actually finding spaces that might not be right. I didn't know that they weren't right for me at the time, but until I'm in them, I don't know that they're not right. But also then just sitting back and looking at the conversations, thinking about what people are saying, deconstructing what they're saying, and soaking myself in it. And I was delivering training on Saturday just gone to a group of therapists, and somebody said, you know, as a non-neurodivergent person, as a neurotypical person, as a neurotypical therapist, how can I best learn to support neurodivergent people? And I said, the best thing that you can do is to go and soak up the conversations that are happening. Go and embed yourself in there. Don't engage, just sit back, just listen, just pay attention. And I don't mean that in a voyeuristic way. I mean that in actually think about what people are saying, think about the dynamics that are happening, the barriers that people are expressing, really kind of think about that and process that. And that's kind of what it takes. And I think Christine is a really good example of someone who maybe has, firstly, barriers in accessing spaces like that for reasons of celebrity. But I do have to say, I know celebrities who are on a par with Christine, who are autistic and are doing those things and are doing that kind of work. But secondly, there is another problem in that we have organisations like the National Autistic Society who snatch up celebrities and create barriers, and then people fawn. You know, that somebody else comes along, gives them a bit of an autistic person a bit of validation. You're going to love someone when you've never had that. You know, and here's the authority coming to you as well. So I think there are so many barriers, but we have to recognize and identify those barriers, and we have a responsibility to keep reaching out. Even if that gets rejected and that gets knocked back, or even if we're not safe, we still have to keep reaching out. Otherwise, then people do get lost along the way, and the change that we want to see, we have to be.
I want to come back to doing the work as a phrase. I'm thinking, so I'm in part of a WhatsApp group with some autistic writers, and actually one of them a while ago was, I think they were talking about this, I suppose, the stereotype of an autistic man who cannot stop talking, actually, and who cannot hear and only monologues. And they were saying you've got to do the work. And again, I was thinking it's very therapy speak in a way, is doing the work. And as you said, there's a lot of traumatized people trying to support other traumatized people. Doing the work can be in the context of, oh, I just had this diagnosis. Lots of people around me do not understand this at all. I do not understand it. I'm filled with ideas that actually are a mismatch of Simon Baron-Cohen and Asperger and the Big Bang Theory and whatever else has gone into my head, and a lifetime of accumulated stuff. That work may not even be able to happen in conventional, because we're talking about communities, but I'm going to say individually. It may be difficult in individual therapy spaces to actually, and it may be difficult in individual family units, really. So yeah, well, it really resonates just then that it would be great if more people, more allies were able to help neurodivergent people do this work of reflection and community building, and, you know, recognize that that's in the context of a shifting, fluid self-identity that could indeed get caught up by narratives that are not necessarily very helpful. Is anybody helping us do this work? Who's helping? Who's good? Who's helpful?
We cannot do anything without allies. Like we cannot do all this on our own. It's impossible to do that. And there are it's interesting that in my experience, when you kind of identify a person or an organization like led by a person who I would deem as an ally, it's not long before you start getting onto that conversation of, oh, you might be autistic too. You know, and it becomes that gray area of actually the people who are allied with us are probably the people who are social justice motivated, who communicate in particular ways, who, you know, and then you start wandering down that road of you're one of us. So it's, and I don't mean that in a kind of an othering sense, that the them and us narrative has already been established. It's been long established. And I don't take any pleasure from kind of leaning into that narrative at all, because I think it's wrong and it's problematic. But there is a distinct difference in experience. So there is a them and an us. It's the framework and the lens that we use to kind of look at that. So we do have allies, but again, it's pockets rather than large spheres or large organizations. And I would actually say that if you are an individual person looking for support, I wouldn't be looking at the National Autistic Society. I wouldn't be looking at a university. I'd be looking at a small local organization and finding out that maybe that's a good place to start, particularly one that's led by autistic people or neurodivergent people, or, you know, so that's might not be a healthy place, but it might be a healthier place to start. And at least it sets you off on that kind of journey. And I think for all of us are of an age and of a length of knowing our diagnosis and knowing ourselves that those things weren't available to us. when we came along. Like it breaks my heart every day knowing I was diagnosed in 2003 and there were autistic people gathering, advocating, fighting, and I wasn't aware of them until probably 15 years later. So I missed out on all of that that would have helped me and would have made me feel purposeful and useful, and which is what so many autistic people feel, especially late diagnosed adult. Like, you want to do things, you want to change, you don't want other people, but until you've done that work, it's kind of irresponsible because you might not know enough, or you might not be able to communicate it well enough. You might not have, and this isn't about you have to think the way that I do as Kieran, or do the things that Kieran does. That's not what I'm saying at all. But you have to think about this stuff for a while, and you have to really let it sit, and you have to think about the trauma you've experienced and processing that trauma, and you can't do that on your own. You do need support, but you need support from people that recognize you as a human being and not just as Bob the autistic person, that recognize that there are different facets of who you are as a human, different intersectionalities of your experience, different experiences, and actually humanize you and validate you. That's the key, and that's where we find good allies, people who are prepared to do that, and people who are prepared to say, I don't know enough and I don't know well enough to be able to support you, so let's find someone who can. That ownership of not knowing is as key as it is knowing.
Absolutely. What's the phrase? A little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing.
The road to hell is paved with good intentions. There are so many well-intentioned people out there, so many well-intentioned professionals who have that little bit of knowledge,
but not enough reflection.
Think about what they don't know.
Yeah.
And it's in fact still the majority, isn't it, of professionals who don't know what they don't know, because the majority of professionals are still working within the medical models and within the deficit models.
Oh, they're just not in the community, and you can't expect them to be either, because they're just simply not, and we're not in their their world either, necessarily. But like I often said that a lot of professionals, particularly within historically in the education system, have seen me as the problem, whereas I understand the double empathy problem, and I know in this situation we are both the problem.
Yeah.
And we're too busy being each other's problem to understand that we actually have a shared goal. In that case, it was to get my child through education. We both wanted that, but because there was a fundamental sort of difference in culture and understanding and knowledge, and just not enough reflective practice, that there are people out there living incredibly different lives from us. And unless you understand that community in any context, even superficially, would be a start. But unless you immerse yourself in that community, it's very, very difficult for you to be doing good practice within it.
And again, coming back to, people who might define themselves through that kind of advocate lens, who are communicating being autistic to the world. That's maybe a better way of phrasing it. And this might not work for everybody, but for me, I made an active decision without even realizing that it was about sitting in an empathy gap, to understand where different professionals from different fields were coming from. So, I've gone through PBS training. I have literally a bookcase filled with the most awful and disgusting books that I've forced myself to read, because I want to understand why they think the way that they do. And I want to understand their methodology and their ideology and that helps me to communicate why aspects of that might be okay, but also why aspects of that might be incredibly harmful as well. And, so it's sitting in that empathy gap is about understanding somebody else's experience as best as you can. And at the minute we have I think a real dynamic where it is a very much us and them from both sides, if that makes sense. There's not sides, but you know what I mean. That's still an us and them now. It's really that we don't have the language to talk about this. We often say this. The words we have aren't good enough. But from a professional, non-professional kind of narrative, I need to understand what that professional might have been through professionally, what their understanding is, what their education is. And then it's getting to know them as a human. And you don't see that from professional services going the opposite direction. It's not a bi-directional experience at all. To be a good communicator, you need to be able to understand things. To be a good professional, you need to be understand things that are out of your wheelhouse and not get trapped within what you think you know.
That makes me think of my of seeing Dinah Murray when so you were talking about her in the last podcast, one of the theories behind monotropism, and I interviewed her when she was dying of pancreatic cancer, and I knew it was important to kind of, and her son Fergus had kind of suggested I interview her too. It was capturing the words of an autistic elder, and I really, really remember how she was talking about the importance of seeing the viewpoint of whoever you might see as your enemy, and planting the seeds, gradually planting the seeds. And she said there were many instances where over time people had come closer to her point of view, but that hadn't been from her alienating them. It had just been, the gradual planting of seeds. And she was a huge inspiration in that way.
Such a massive loss.
Oh, huge loss. I was really, I mean, I'm thinking back to when I was in 2011, I was going to dash off and do a show all about whether I could get diagnosed for autism. And I was maybe working with the ARC in Stockton, the arts venue, and I was happily bobbing off to speak to someone at the University of Durham who was going to put electrodes on my brain or something. And I was thinking that maybe this is a thing. And luckily, I turned up actually at the National Autistic Society Professional Conference, where Wen Lawson was presenting back then on The Passionate Mind, which was a book that really expanded on monotropism. And I was led through that conference. So I had a super privilege, because it was like, oh, I go on Radio 4 sometimes and do poems. Oh, come in, Kate, come in, crack on. This is not a usual route. That opened up to me a world of activists and an alternative narrative. But it wasn't until 2017 that I met my first out autistic woman of a similar age to me. So that took a long time. I didn't tour my show. I think I did recognise that there was a quite a big gap that I was in. But again, I've been so lucky to fill that gap by being a performer who had access to various spaces. Really lucky.
Yeah. And privilege plays a part of that as well, because it's interesting, it took you that long to see yourself in someone else, and how many autistic people from different backgrounds and different experiences never see themselves in anyone else. It is still a white narrative, isn't it? And it's a white heterosexual. It's changing. The queer narrative is very much becoming central to the autistic experience, I think, and more people are recognizing that and going beyond the superficialness of queer means gay. But it's still not there, is it? It's still nowhere near there enough. But again, that's part of doing the work. That change has happened because people have done the work, and the more people that do the work in their own way, their own unique way, within what's within your power to do, and that's going to look different for everybody. That then is going to influence change and make things better for everybody else. Sorry, Nick, I jumped over you.
It's all right. I did you before. I think if we were going to frame our now trilogy plus podcast with the lovely Kieran Rose and the ideas that we've framed within it, and I think I'm going to go with a woman far better than me, and I'm going to quote Maya Angelou, and I'm going to say, we can do the best you can until you know better, and then when you know better, you can do better. Thanks for tuning in to Neurotypical's Don't Juggle Chainsaws. We're so glad you joined us today to explore the fascinating world of neurodivergence with your hosts, me, Nick King.
And me, Kate Fox. If our conversation sparked a thought, a question, or even a smile, don't keep it to yourself. Drop us a line at hello@neurotypicalsdon'tjugglechainsaws.co.uk or visit our website neurotypicalsdon'tjugglechainsaws.co.uk to write in. We'd love to hear from you.
If you enjoyed today's episode, consider leaving us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast platform.
Until next time, keep embracing the unique ways you juggle the chainsaws of life.